And do you feel any remorse for it now?
No.
Does that strike you as odd?
Not really, no. It's either me or them. Those tough days, and we get to go with the tough.
Well, it wasn't really either you or them. You could have walked away from most of those.
Oh, yes, could have walked away, but you'd have lost face if you could have walked away.
Do you reckon you should have hanged?
Oh, yes, yeah.
Hayes was born in Glebe, a rough working-class suburb of Sydney in 1911. Hayes' life from his earliest days was steeped in violence. During one fight, a boy called him a dirty Chow, thinking that Hayes was of Asian descent. The racist nickname stuck. He learnt to fight on the streets, and by 11, he was part of a gang battling other louts and orphans for turf.
Those gangs were the breeding ground for the criminals. And in fact, what happened to Hayes was he found himself at age 14, after half a dozen convictions for shoplifting, being sent to Gosford Boys' Home. And Gosford Boys' Home, as he said, was where he met, at age 14 and a half, murderers. It was the classic case of the university for criminals. And it absolutely set Hayes on a course, as far as he was concerned, where he learnt everything by the time he was 17 about being a criminal.
By 18, Chow had 14 charges to his name, including demanding money by menace and assault. He was well on his way to becoming Sydney's most terrifying standover man. But even a hard man like Chow had a weakness, and her name was Topsy. She was his childhood sweetheart, and the two tied the knot in 1932.
She was a nurse and was never really fully aware of what he was up to, which was an incredible thing because as Sydney's probably most notorious gangster, it must have been pretty hard to keep it hidden from his own wife.
At the age of 23, with a string of arrests behind him, he achieved his goal and became Australia's first recognised gangster. It was a term recently coined for America's notorious criminal Al Capone, but had never been used in Australia.
A major criminal in Sydney of the day was a guy named Frank Green. Hayes sees him at a party. Green comes up to Hayes and says, "You were eyeing off my woman." And Hayes said, "No, I wasn't." And he said, "Yes, you were, and I don't like it." Hayes leaves the party soon after, and he knows Green's reputation. But he decides that he's going to do something about this. Hayes calls out to him, "Hey, Frank." And Green turns around and says, "What do you want?" And Hayes says, "I've got a present for you." Immediately whacks him with the metal pipe across the head, such that Green is actually in hospital for the next 4 weeks. This incident is plastered over the front of the afternoon papers in Sydney that Frank Green, one of the most feared standover men in Sydney, has been bashed. And here's the new guy to be feared in Sydney, Chow Hayes.
By the age of 28, Frederick John Chow Hayes had racked up 70 convictions. Theft, resisting arrest, demanding money with menaces, riotous behaviour, armed robbery occasioning bodily harm, and soon, murder.
All he cared about was, as soon as he was out of jail, you had to quickly re-establish that you were the toughest guy in Sydney. Your reputation relied on that so that you could automatically collect the standover without having to do much about it. If you didn't, there would be other young up-and-comers who would want to establish their reputation as the toughest man in Sydney, and he wasn't going to let that happen no matter what.
Chow Hayes would graduate from thug to murderer with the killing of Bobby Lee in 1951. Lee was a boxer who'd come to blows with a member of Hayes' gang. Lee knew that Chow would retaliate, so he decided to get in first. He went to Chow's home and, in a case of mistaken identity, shot and killed Hayes' nephew, Danny Simmons. Bobby Lee disappeared into hiding and Chow burned for revenge. Not long after, Chow got wind that Lee was going to be at the Ziegfeld Club, a seedy dive in Sydney's King Street.
And this was Chow's opportunity to go down there and get back at him for the shooting of Danny Simmons. And he made a fatal mistake by telling his wife that he was going to the Ziegfeld room, and she said, "I love to go dancing." And of course he wasn't in a position to say, "Well, actually, I'm not going there to dance. I'm going down there to shoot somebody."
So he goes to the Ziegfeld Club, and of course, here's Bobby Lee sitting there with a bunch of people, women all around him, and Chow comes up to him and he says something like, "Well, you're not going to do anything to me. We're sitting in a room full of people." And Chow just gets his gun out.
In front of his wife Topsy and 350 witnesses, Chow shot Lee at close range.
By the time the police arrived, there were only about 80 people, and those 80 people were either visited by Chow or just through weight of reputation. None of them actually saw anything that happened, and they couldn't find who actually pulled the trigger and killed Bobby Lee.
Chow sauntered through 2 mistrials before policeman Ray Gunner Kelly found his Achilles heel.
Kelly said to Hayes, he said, "Well, look," he said, "your wife was there. We're going to charge her with being an accessory." Chow, and probably one of his very few acts of chivalry, actually put his hand up for the killing, and subsequently he was sentenced to hang.
But escaped the hangman's noose when capital punishment was abolished in 1955.
When Hayes is eventually released from jail in the 1970s, the world has changed. It's 2 decades later. The criminal background that Hayes relied on had largely changed, and now it was the drug trade. Most of the people that he knew had either died or had grown old, had disappeared. He found himself almost with nothing to do and no one to stand over.
Chow was not content to fade into obscurity and approached a Sydney journalist, David Hickey, to tell his story.
He was interested still, as an old man, in making sure that his reputation was as the feared man. And in some ways, the appeal of the celebrity criminal was there for him, and he resented the fact that there were all these, while he'd been away, new criminals had come along who got all the front pages of the newspapers, and everyone had forgotten about him.
Hayes returned briefly to the media spotlight when the book was published in 1990. Chow's craggy face and cold reptilian eyes caught the attention of artist Bill Leake.
I really wanted to paint Chow Hayes because a painting done from life gives the viewer an opportunity to know what it was like to share the same space with that person, breathe the same air. And so I became convinced that I had an historical responsibility to paint this bloke.
There was a sense of urgency in the endeavour. The old gangster was dying of cancer, so Bill Leake set about immortalising Chow in oil paint.
He was in such a terrible state. He had an oxygen mask on, which he kept moving aside, and he was coughing up shards of his lungs, I think. I couldn't tell what it was, but it didn't look too good to me. And I passed on regards from David Hickey, because I told David that I was going out there to see him the next day or something. And he just said, "Don't talk to me about Hickey." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because he robbed me." He honestly believed that the book that David wrote about him was going to be an international bestseller. There'd be some Hollywood star playing the part of him in the movie and all that sort of thing. I think he seriously believed that David was squirreling away millions, and Chow wasn't seeing any of it. And I said, "Oh, so," I said, "you're still a bit dirty on him, eh, Chow?" He said, "Dirty?" He said, "Bill, I'm gonna shoot him." And I said, "I don't think you're in a fit state to do that, mate." And he said, "If I have to crawl in there, I'm gonna go into his office at the Sydney Morning Herald and I'll wait outside his door, and when he comes out, I'll bloody well shoot him."
Chow believed you could measure the worth of a man by the number of people who attended his funeral. When Sydney's once feared standover man died on May 7, 1993, just 5 mourners stood over his grave.